You know, thinking a lot about the Great Reset the last couple of days, especially as it becomes more and more clear that the assault on fossil fuels is going to keep ramping up more and more. You know, originally when the Green New Deal was unveiled by AOC, I looked at that and I said, this is absurd. You know, she wants to get rid of fossil fuels. You could never do that. You destroy the standard of living of not only every American, but I mean just people across the world. It's a matter of the supply of energy. If you just kneecap the global energy supply, you're going to create mass starvation, famine, global poverty going to like 99%. It would be apocalyptic. People would never tolerate losing all of that wealth. But then the Wu flu came along. Funny how these things work out. And with the Wu flu, people were forced to tolerate a tremendous decay in their standard of living. People could no longer, much of the world, at least for a time, go out to eat. They couldn't enjoy nice walks in the park without being, harassed by violent men. They couldn't really drive their car around. The police would tell them, no, you can't do that. All of these ordinary aspects of daily life were curtailed, and they were limited extremely. Much in the same way in which they would be extremely curtailed if we suddenly got rid of fossil fuels, or if everyone was forced to drive an electric car. The freedoms that we had in 2019 they would look like a Shangri-La. It would be a time in the past of what would be considered unprecedented amounts of freedom and wealth. But here we are now in 2021, and many people around the world have already given up a lot of those luxuries. They're already gone. And so it's not nearly as hard now for the authorities to say, hey, remember all those luxuries that you had a couple years ago? Yeah, they're never coming back. Not because the virus is going to be here forever, but because you see this thing, global warming. It's very bad. And it's your fault. It's because you had a nice life. That's why the Earth is going to die, unless you do exactly what we, the party of Davos, say you should do. At a time of great scarcity and of great economic unrest, it will behoove the global elites to try and advance their agenda as rapidly as possible. Because we've already suffered such a steep decline in the standard of living, they're going to say, hey, we can't just let people's standard of living return to normal. We have to do all of our reforms that are going to bring their standard of living down while it's already down, so that people don't feel that we're making them incredibly poor. We're just going to keep them poor. You see, we can say, oh, the Wu flu, that's what made you poor, even though it was their policies which made people poor. I think that this is the strategy that they've been working towards for quite some time now. Of course, we've seen the occasional trial balloon think piece in the mainstream media. I think places, like The Atlantic or The New Yorker have talked about, oh, hey, we had COVID lockdowns, now let's have climate change lockdowns. And I have to say, it's a pretty smart plan. That would be a great way to try and take advantage of all that has already transpired. Why let a great crisis go to waste, right? Well, the problem that I see with this potential plan, if I were looking at it from their perspective, is that in a place like the United Kingdom or France, nation states, this plan might work because people there, they take for granted, hey, the regime has my best interests at heart, and if I disagree with what the regime is doing, the regime represents the nation. It represents the general will. So if ever there's a time when I'm in conflict with the regime, I'm the problem. There's something wrong with me. The Australians seemingly think the exact same way. Canadians, too. And there are a lot of countries in the world that are built on that kind of a framework, that they just inherently think that the regime is good, and therefore whatever the regime does is good. But then you have countries like the United States and China that are built on a bit of a different model. The United States and China are very similar in that the regimes derive their legitimacy from their perceived positive impact on the standard of living of ordinary citizens. The US and China are very similar in that respect. Mr. Xi and Mr. Biden, their approval ratings both hinge on their ability to make their constituents believe that their leadership is improving their standard of living in a concrete way. That means low unemployment, low gas prices, relatively high economic growth, although that's something that doesn't really apply to the United States. Our economy doesn't really grow, but China's does. And so in China, they want to see very high rates of economic growth, close to double digits if possible. It's part of the reason why they have that big real estate bubble, is because real estate is 20% of their GDP. China builds all these ghost cities to try and artificially boost their GDP, and now it's driving one of those ghost city producers, Evergrande, into bankruptcy. And so focusing on the US, since that's where I am, that's where I care the most about, that's where I have the most hope for in the world. If I didn't, I would be trying to leave this country and go somewhere else, but I do still think that if the tide ever starts to turn, it's going to begin here. We Americans, on the whole, I don't like to draw broad generalizations, especially about a group of people who have as little in common as Americans do. But the one thing we do all have in common is a shared interest in our own prosperity. See what I did there? We all have a shared selfish interest in our own well-being. And to the extent that the regime in Washington is harming our well-being, not helping it, it loses legitimacy. This is why governments in the US rise and fall. You have to convince enough people in enough states across the country that you are doing what's in their best interests. And sure, you have your deep red or your deep blue states that are always going to go vote one way or the other no matter what. When you try and do something as brazen as destroy people's standard of living by removing the greatest and most efficient and cheapest forms of energy from the U.S. economy, taking away energy, which is the lifeblood of any economy. If you can't, how much you're able to produce is a pretty direct derivative of how much energy you're able to produce. So less energy means less stuff to consume, and consumers get a little uneasy. Now, people have been trained. I won't deny this. People are being trained to consume a lot less, which, in and of itself, is that all bad? No, but when people are unable to consume basic necessities of life, meat, vegetables, staples, and yes, gasoline and diesel fuel, this becomes a very serious problem. It's not just that, the cheap plastic toys at Walmart have doubled in price. It's that your food is going up in price. And it doesn't matter if you're a super partisan who will never blame your own guy for that. There is a vast majority of this country who is willing to blame whoever's in office for doing that to them. And there is no real loyalty to the overarching regime in this country. People do not, we don't have a common myth or an identity in this country like they do in a place in France. In France, people are loyal to the regime. They just are. Or I shouldn't say that. It's because individual regimes can come and go, but France will always remain. The French nation is going to be there. There's going to be a tricolor flag. They're going to have a capital in Paris, and it's going to be a republican form of government. That is never going to change. The individual people who make up that regime, they can change all the time. But the idea of France itself will never come into question. Whereas here in the United States, it's quite the opposite. People here do not have any real commitment to the Union as such. If the Union outlives its usefulness, as I believe it has, and in fact begins to antagonize ordinary Americans, I think that its days will be numbered. The United States does not have that unwavering acceptance of its existence that some other regimes do, or that some other countries do. It's not a given that the United States will always exist. And the more that people, or the more that the current caretakers of the regime in Washington antagonize the tax base and antagonize just ordinary people in general, the less certain the U.S.'s future becomes, because more people will begin to question whether or not we should have this government in Washington at all. And that's a good thing, because that's a pressure release valve that we have here that they don't have in a place like France. Because in a place like France, yes, they have revolutions and things. They have people who rise up in the streets and protest. But that can only get you so far. Ultimately, if the people in the current regime can defend Paris from falling, the French government is going to continue on as it has. Whereas here in the U.S., nobody would ever think about trying to siege the Capitol and wage some insurrection and actually take over the government. Nobody wants to do that. People want the Capitol to go away, and they just want to ignore it. And so if the Capitol makes life sufficiently difficult for people in this country to where they say, hey, you can't have your gasoline cars. If you live, more than a few miles outside the city, it sucks to be you. You're going to have to ride a horse for the rest of your life. People aren't going to put up with that. They'll say, you know what? No, I'm just going to ignore you. And thus, the federal government's power will become weaker and weaker. I don't think that Washington has the ability to implement the principles of the Great Reset. Not in its entirety. I don't think it can happen, because people don't want that. People don't want to live in the pod and eat the bugs. They don't want to drive a Chevy Volt. They don't want gas to be $8 a gallon. They don't want ammunition to be all but banned, which, with banning Russian ammo, that's pretty much what the Biden administration is doing, making ammunition prohibitively expensive. All of these things add up. And every time that they do a little thing like this, people have more of an incentive to reject the federal government. And that's what you've seen. I mean, I've seen it in real time. Back when I first came to this conclusion in 2016-ish, 2015, no, I guess it was 16. Back at that time, there were not people who were seriously considering the United States ceasing to exist. They were not, they would say, oh, that's crazy, neo-Confederate claptrap or something. But I could see it back then. Even if very few people realized it back then, they were becoming more and more fed up with the federal government. I had watched it for a decade, since the Tea Party. And I remember wanting Hillary to actually win back in 2016, because I thought that she was just such a detestable human being that she would create a lot more animus towards the federal government. Interestingly enough, Trump was able to become president without actually merging himself with the federal government. He was always viewed as a separate entity from the federal government during his time in office, which was useful in its own way. So back to the Great Reset. You could get away with the principles of the Great Reset when you're just talking about the highly educated, upper middle class white liberals. They could go along with this sort of thing. You could convince them. But there are so many people across this country who will never even consider the principles of the Great Reset. They don't want to live in their apartment. They don't want to own nothing. They don't want to, live in a society where everything is a subscription service. People don't want Netflix for their clothes. They want to own their own clothes. They want to have their own identity. People in the United States drive a lot. We do a lot of driving. And a lot of people, practically speaking, just can't accept an electric car. I don't think that the people who actually genuinely like cars are a big enough contingent to stop the electric car thing, but the practicality of it, really does. And the time that it takes, not to mention the fact that it's not any better for the environment. It's a ridiculous scam. It's arguably worse for the environment if you actually care about the planet. So in short, and I know I'm going a bit long here, I think that in order for the Great Reset to succeed across the world, which I think is possible, I think that it could succeed in a lot of places, it will destroy the United States, which I think is a good thing. You will have, only a few places like California and New York and Massachusetts and such, irredeemable hellholes, which will go along with this sort of thing. But there will be so much opposition within this country if they try and push these things that it will, people will reach the conclusion that, hey, we tried our best. It's time to end this. This is dangerous. There's no more games. We don't have time to wait another 4 years or whatever. We need to stop obeying this now. Now, it's not guaranteed the feds will go this direction. Perhaps you'll get a strong Republican who replaces Joe Biden, which, again, the word strong Republican just sounds wrong coming off my tongue. But if we did get into that position, there's somebody, a DeSantis or Trump, challenges Biden, wins, and comes in, I think that this, by that time, will be a very big issue. And it will be the kind of thing to where either they just say no and they stop implementing these things, or the country is destroyed anyway, which is fine by me either way. It's tough because you look at the last year, what they were able to get away with. It's hard for me to say, oh, they can't get away with these things. But they didn't really get away with it everywhere. There's so many places across America that never obeyed all of these edicts, that were not even subject to them to begin with, like where I live. And the other thing is the virus was a novel virus. It was something new. It was scary. It wasn't something that's been beaten to our head for 20 or 30 years, like global warming. Heck, there are people old enough to remember global cooling. And this is something that's been beaten to our head over and over again. Oh my gosh, we're just 5 years away from climate chaos. And then, every time they set, a deadline, it keeps passing, and we're all still alive. So on this one front, I have hope. I have long-term hope. I've had long-term hope for a long time. It's just in the short term, I'm very concerned. Go out and try and buy a case of ammo right now. Prices are through the roof, even compared to how they were a few months ago, because now we have no more Russian ammo. These sorts of things, when these barriers get put in front of people, they can overcome, but it takes a lot of time. You got to find ways around these things. And the more these barriers keep getting put in front of us and inhibiting our standard of living, making us poorer, in effect. Because if you don't have access to something, whether it's because you don't have enough money, or whether it's because you're being blocked by the regime, your standard of living is down. It's an economic problem. Scarcity is relatively higher. And scarcity is not something that feels good to people. People don't like scarcity. People like abundance. And I think what we've learned over the past, year and a half is that, at least where I live, I think that abundance is much more popular than scarcity, even when you try and use some big scary boogeyman to justify the scarcity. They say, hey, there's something really bad over here, so you better give up all of your wealth and your access to all these resources, because this really scary thing might happen if you don't. In the case of a virus, it's very different than global warming. A virus is a particularized individual thing. It's something that people can be afraid of. It's a invisible killer. Something that could just come inside you and ravage your body, and you have no idea. Whereas global warming, it's not going to directly affect you. That's something that's always going to be a minority issue, kind of like abortion, but an even more apocalyptic. It's essentially apocalyptic abortionism, and it's something that's been overtly partisan for decades at this point. People have seen this movie before, and so state-sanctioned scarcity, for the sake of trying to somewhat inhibit global warming, it's just not going to fly. Little things that people don't see, like emissions controls on cars, which have led us to these highly computerized cars that now can't be built because, all of these chip shortages, we can't build cars. Back in the days of carburetors, that wouldn't have been an issue. There were no chips in the cars. Everything was made of metal. You didn't need silicone. Sure, you had wires for spark plugs and for the starter, but that was about it. So I guess that's all I have to say on this matter. I shouldn't keep going on. It's gone on way too long as it is. But I guess in some ways I'm trying to reassure myself, but a lot of this is just me trying to think through things. So with that said, I'll see you folks back here tomorrow.